Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today we are going to be doing a Historia Civilis video, the Roman Pomerium. Now, you might be thinking, we've done these videos. We've done the Roman videos by Historia Civilis. You are correct, but you are also wrong. We have not done several of the videos. And I really kind of but I just kind of looked over some of these videos, like the Pomerium, the Triumph, some of the other early stuff. So that's what we're going to attack today, the Roman Pomerium. Make sure to hit that like button. Let's learn together, what is the Roman Pomerium besides what I think it is, which is just a line dividing the city. Let's go.
Was founded on a murder. According to legend, Rome was founded on a murder.
Romulus and Remus, and then somebody killed Romulus killed Remus, I think.
The dispute arose between two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, when they led an expedition to found a new city next to the Tiber River. The brothers agreed that the ideal location for this new city would be somewhere on this set of hills, but they couldn't exactly agree on where to begin construction. One brother, Romulus, was primarily interested in the military defense of the city, and therefore favored a centrally located hill called the Palatine. The other brother, Remus, was thinking of trade and commerce, and so favored a hill that enjoyed easy access to the river, called the Aventine. This disagreement set off a full-scale 10 out of 10 argument. The group accompanying the brothers split right down the middle, until there was a Palatine faction under Romulus and an Aventine faction under Remus.
Quick question for all you guys. How accurate is this? I know it's based off of this tale. It's like a tale. So by default, it kind of leans more fiction. But is there anything, in your opinion, comment below, is there anything of value / truth to this entire ordeal?
There was no possibility of reaching a consensus, so each side agreed to go to their preferred hill, make some animal sacrifices, and await a sign from the gods. Remus and friends on the Aventine Hill soon saw 6 vultures flying overhead. The brothers claimed to be descended from Mars, god of war, and for obvious reasons, the vulture was his bird, so this made a lot of sense. Clearly, this was the sign they were waiting for. Remus marched over and informed his brother that his hill had received a favorable sign from the gods. Romulus responded, saying that just now, 12 vultures had landed on his hill.
Socks. Hey, socks, Remus. We got 12 in the back over here. What are you talking about? You're 6. We got 12. Classic brother one-upping right there.
Remus was like, "You're a damn liar," and insisted on seeing the vultures for himself. Remus was not satisfied by this. Sure, he argued, the gods had shown each brother a sign, but Remus's sign had appeared first. Which must mean that the gods slightly favored his plan. Romulus was not having this. He argued that 12 vultures was obviously better than 6 vultures, and besides, they had actually landed on his hill, which must mean that that's where they were supposed to set down roots. The argument escalated until each brother gave up and went back to their own camp. Romulus was like, to hell with this, and began construction on the Palatine Hill. Job number 1 was digging a trench, which would later serve as the base for the city's walls. When Remus saw this, he and his supporters marched right over to the Palatine Hill. They may have brought weapons. Remus and company angrily crossed Romulus's little trench, and words were exchanged. Before too long, a fight broke out. When the dust settled, Remus was dead. According to tradition, Romulus struck the killing blow. Romulus would go on to build his city on the Palatine Hill, naming it Roma, or Rome, after himself.
Like a decagon or something.
How much of this actually happened? Maybe some of it, maybe none of it, but the important thing is that later generations of Romans fully integrated this story into their own mythology. But this is all kinda tangentially related to what I really want to talk about today. It may seem like a minor detail, but that trench dug by Romulus would go on to become one of the cornerstones of the Roman legal system. That trench is known as the Pomerium.
Okay.
The Latin word for city is urbe, or urbis, which itself is an offshoot of the word orbis, meaning circle.
Is that where we get urban from?
So why was the word city related to the word circle? In a legal sense, anything inside of a city's pomerium was the actual city, and anything outside the pomerium was something else. To be clear, most cities on the Italian peninsula would have had something resembling a pomerium, but for obvious reasons, Rome's was the most important by far. Over the centuries, Rome would grow beyond the Palatine Hill, and would go on to occupy all 7 hills of Rome, and then some. A few early rulers tried to accommodate this by expanding the Pomerium, but it was impossible to keep up with the city's growth. Eventually, reality set in, and people just accepted that in a legal sense, Rome's city limits were somewhere in the middle of a much larger, unofficial city.
Okay, I mean, that's how it is. Like, we just did a video of like the city of London and like Londinium, and that original Londinium to Saxony, like into the 1066 William the Conqueror state, that particular part of London becomes the city of London, which is a different ordinance than the other parts of London. So I'm guessing a similar sense in this capacity here.
As this happened, the original walls of the Pomerium became less and less important, and over the centuries, they gradually faded away.
So we don't know for sure about this line. I mean, we could kind of track it today and then reverse engineer it, but I don't know.
The Pomerium eventually came to look like an open gap in between the buildings, with some ceremonial stone pillars to mark its place. More or less, an invisible line. Well known to the locals, but easy for the untrained eye to miss.
You have to know. Got it.
Entering the Pomerium was a highly ritualized experience, all tied up in the law and in Roman religious belief. The hyper-legalistic Romans felt that it was important to invent a legal justification for Remus's murder by arguing that any breach in the Pomerium, including literally just walking across the invisible line, represented a symbolic breach in Rome's defenses.
Even though he was his brother?
As such, crossing the Pomerium was a death penalty offense.
Oof.
If this is true, how did people get into the Pomerium? If you want to get super technical, the Pomerium stopped and then started again at a series of designated gates. According to Roman religious
So a gate allowed entry, that's interesting.
thinking, these specific gates were extremely important, since they had been sanctioned by the gods way back in the time of Romulus.
Okay.
This fact became kind of absurd after the actual walls of the Pomerium faded away. Plutarch recounts the story of Pompey trying and failing to fit a group of elephants through one of these designated gates, even though the land to either side of the gate was completely open. It never even occurred to anybody to take 2 steps to the left and walk across that invisible line.
I think it occurred to them, but they were trying to practice tradition and rule.
That's how seriously the Romans took the Pomerium.
Yeah.
In fact, in every meaningful sense, the Pomerium dominated political life. Rome's highest elected officials, namely consuls and praetors, were basically expected to carry out the day-to-day governance of Rome from within the Pomerium. You know, legislation, administration, court cases, religious rights, all that exciting stuff. Here, just as you would expect, elected officials were constrained by the laws of Rome, just like any other citizen. However, once consuls or praetors left the Pomerium, they were technically considered on military campaign, and as such wielded absolute power over life and death. Therefore, you can think of the Pomerium as the invisible line that separated the military world from the civic world. This role switching of Rome's elected officials was embodied in the behavior of their lictors, which were groups of 6 or 12 bodyguards that followed
Lictors or bodyguards. 6 for praetors, 12 for consuls. Okay.
Followed consuls and praetors around for the duration of their term. Inside the Pomerium, lictors carried a ceremonial bundle of sticks. Once they left the Pomerium, they added an axe to the mix, which advertised to the world the consul or praetor's expanded powers. In fact, there was probably an elaborate religious ceremony each time an elected official crossed the Pomerium, but the details of this are lost to us.
Interesting.
You would think that this whole thing would lead to an abuse of power, but it
probably did.
really didn't. The Senate was usually within the Pomerium. Most government buildings were within the Pomerium. Most rich people lived and worked within the Pomerium.
And there was a lot on the countryside, though.
Plus, any decision was subject to a court challenge once they were out of office. In this context, the power available to consuls and praetors outside the Pomerium was pretty useful in a crisis, but didn't factor into normal domestic politics very much. When it came to governors and generals, which the Romans called proconsuls and propraetors, the effect of the Pomerium became even more pronounced. When proconsuls or propraetors crossed the Pomerium, all of their legal command authority evaporated, instantly transforming them back into private citizens. Sometimes, for whatever reason, the Senate would need an active general to be present at one of their meetings, which presented a bit of a problem. When this happened, the Senate would sometimes agree to make the trek out of the Pomerium and hold an ad hoc meeting in some kind of public building, like a temple. This became a big issue in the late 50s BCE, during
Caesar.
the lead up to the Roman civil war between Caesar and Pompey, at which time Pompey was technically an active general. This resulted in a remarkable amount of ping-ponging around to different temples and theaters outside the Pomerium, which I'm sure was annoying to a bunch of grumpy old senators. Another problem related to this was that in order to stand for office, people were required to enter the Pomerium and declare their candidacy in
Unless you're Caesar or Pompey.
person. If a prospective candidate was an active general, or even worse, an active general posted to the other side of the continent, their only option was to leave their post early and cross the Pomerium, relinquishing their command. This tension between standing for election and retaining one's command should be familiar to anybody watching this. Again, going back to the Roman Civil War, one of the central questions leading up to it was what will happen to Caesar when he crosses the Pomerium? When it became clear that the likeliest result of giving up his command would be banishment or death, he didn't, which resulted in a civil war. However, and here comes the dumbest sentence I've ever written, civil wars were the exception and not the rule.
Oh, okay. That's fair.
This same rule, stripping generals of their command when they crossed into the Pomerium, also applied to regular soldiers. Strictly speaking, there were not supposed to be soldiers on the Italian peninsula at all, but sometimes this was unavoidable, and in cases like this, it was useful for everybody to know that entering the Pomerium for any reason would mean the end of their military career. Taken as a whole, this law basically
Thought it also meant death. I guess only in certain circumstance.
made it impossible for any army to enter the Pomerium. Or, to put it another way, no individual crossing the Pomerium could claim to be acting on behalf of the Roman state.
I remember at one point, you see that island in the middle of the Tiber. Forget who it was. It was, can't remember who it was, but it was during, right after Caesar's death. They had like a whole army on that island, like in reserve or something like that, because they couldn't cross the Pomerium.
Army to enter as a whole, this law referred to acting on behalf of the Roman state. As we know, violating the Pomerium was considered a symbolic attack on the city itself, whether it came from a foreign invader or from a Roman soldier. Along these same lines, it may not surprise you to learn that weapons were forbidden within the Pomerium.
Yeah.
This was taken quite seriously when it came to swords, but it wasn't that unusual for people to show up with clubs and daggers during riots or whatever, which I assume is just because those things are easier to hide.
Oh yeah.
There were exceptions to this rule, though. During a national emergency, the Senate could appoint a dictator for a 6-month term.
We've seen that before.
Unlike every other Roman official, a dictator's decisions could not be vetoed. And more importantly for our purposes today, a dictator's command authority did not evaporate when they crossed the invisible line, giving them unchecked power to order soldiers into the Pomerium. As a symbol of this power, a dictator's lictors were allowed to keep their axes and behave as if they were on military campaign at all times. Citizens knew what this meant, and
How many dictators did Rome have?
it was a shocking sight to see. Obviously, the dictatorship was a dangerous tool, and so it was sparingly used throughout Rome's history. A similar mechanism that was much more commonly used was the senatus consultum ultimum, or the final act. With the final act,
We've seen this before too. The final act being like, I've seen the final act like a few times. So is it the final or the final act?
the Senate empowered the consuls to defend the Republic by any means necessary. Any means meant that they could ignore laws, including the laws of the Pomerium.
So they're basically dictator.
This may seem like a subtle difference, but it's important in terms of the legal system. Under the dictatorship, Rome put the law in the hands of one individual, with absolutely no oversight. Under the final act, everything remained the same, but the consuls could ignore certain laws if they needed to, with the Senate providing oversight. Although the results may have looked similar, the final act was much less disruptive to the Roman legal system.
More bureaucracy in the final act.
The most famous usage of the final act came in 63 BCE.
That's right before like Cicero, maybe? Or Cassius?
When the Senate empowered the consuls to put down a conspiracy to overthrow the government by any means necessary. The consul Cicero captured 5 of the conspirators, and then, without a trial, condemned them to death, and had them executed right there in the middle of the Pomerium.
Oof.
Under the final act, Cicero was allowed to break the law like this, but
And then he becomes a moderate.
the entire incident was highly offensive to the Roman people, and he paid a high political price for it. Finally, let's talk about elections. This may be counterintuitive, but certain kinds of voting were actually forbidden within the Pomerium. This rule had to do with the Assembly of the Centuries, the body that was responsible for empowering generals through the election of consuls and praetors. During these elections, citizens were divided into metaphorical military units, and these units voted together as a bloc. By now, it should be clear why this was a problem. We know that soldiers became private citizens when they crossed the Pomerium, but how did that work for metaphorical soldiers? It was unclear. What about the consuls overseeing the election? Holding an election with a bunch of metaphorical military units was a little bit like commanding one big metaphorical army, right? If so, was that allowed within the Pomerium? Legally, this was one big gray area. In order to avoid these tough questions, on every election day, a big chunk of Rome's population stopped what they were doing and exited the Pomerium, making their way to the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars, which was a relatively empty piece of land outside the Pomerium that was deliberately set aside for military activities, both real and metaphorical.
Okay.
The only way to cross the Pomerium was through one of the designated gates, and on election day, this turned a 20-minute walk into an all-day ordeal. Rich people could get around this by exiting the Pomerium early and staying in one of their villas near the Campus Martius, but for everybody else, this was a real disincentive to vote.
Probably by accidental design, but then held up through true design.
So, broadly speaking, we can say that the Pomerium was the legal mechanism that separated Rome's military from Rome's government. For centuries, this law kept the peace and stopped ambitious generals from entering the city at the head of an army. That is, save for one enormous exception, the Roman triumph.
Which we'll do next, because we have a whole video on that coming. So make sure you are subscribed to make sure you're subscribed to see that one. Yeah, interesting, fun video. Pomerium, kind of a little bit of backstory context of Romulus and Remus, and like the death of Remus, and like little the circular, and then sort of the etymology of said words. But yeah, overall, great video about Historia Civilis. We have an entire series of Historia Civilis in Rome on our channel, so make sure you go check that out if you haven't. It follows the civil wars, it follows Caesar, it follows pretty much Caesar into Antony, and Antony into Octavian, and all the way until Cleopatra and Antony die, and Marcus Agrippa and all that stuff as well. So highly recommend watching those videos on our channel to kind of get a sense of the entire Roman civil wars. But until next time, I will see you next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.